Let's talk Nuggets Timberwolves. I have a whole lot of thoughts about this series. I am so excited. I do think these are the two best teams out west. What's your first key here?
My first key is I think it's an obvious one for this series. How much can this elite Minnesota defense really disrupt the Denver offense? I mean, it is a battle of the Titans that we are about to get into in this series. I have not been this excited for a playoff series this year, maybe in my life, man. I mean, Nick Sixers has been good. We got some good ones last year. I'm gassed up on this series, man. I am so fired up. And I know the Thunder, the Magic, the Celtics, and the Cavaliers, they all have a better playoff defensive rating than the Timberwolves right now, but the Thunder got to play the Pelicans. The Magic and Cavs negate each other, and then the Celtics got to play the Heat. Like, I think it's obvious that the Timberwolves have the playoffs' best remaining defense, and it's important to recognize how much they crushed the Suns' offense in round one. Like, they wrecked them. The Suns posted an offensive rating of 109.3 in round one versus the Timberwolves. The Suns were the number 10 regular season offense in basketball. They had an offensive rating of 116.8. The Timberwolves held them 7.5 points below their regular season offensive rating. Like, you're taking a team that was number 10 in offensive rating and you turn them into the number 26 offense in basketball. That's equivalent to the Spurs for context. Like, that's ridiculous. And on the flip side of that, they posted the number one offensive rating of any team in the playoff field, 123.2 offensive rating against Phoenix. And in the regular season, these two teams split the regular season matchups 2-2. The Timberwolves have an offensive rating of 116.3 in that, and they post a defensive rating of 110.5. Like, that's remarkable to hold the Denver Nuggets to that. That's also with Karl-Anthony Towns also only playing one regular season game against this group. He's going to be huge in this series. So, to me, the big key is how do they defend Nikola Jokic and how do they defend Jamal Murray? It's a big key against the Lakers. I think it's a big key against Denver, or excuse me, against Minnesota. I don't think there's an answer for Nikola Jokic. I think all the looks that Minnesota threw at Jokic in the regular season, I don't really think it matters. Jokic versus Reed with Gobert on help side. Jokic versus Gobert straight up. Jokic versus Gobert with Reed help side. Jokic versus Anderson with Gobert help side. Like, I don't really think there's a whole lot that Minnesota can do to slow down Jokic. I think you give him a lot of attention. You try to get the ball out of his hands as much as possible, and you try to get the other guys to kill you. What sucks about that is that Denver has an elite shooting supporting cast, and they have Jamal Murray, who's an absolute monster. But I think they can disrupt Jamal a little more, man. Jamal didn't play a great series in the first round against Los Angeles. It was pretty poor. And in the regular season, by his standards, like, he has obviously the clutch huge stretches. He has the 2-game winners, but consistently quarter to quarter, Jamal was not himself. And he struggled in the regular season to create for himself in isolation. The length was really disruptive against Jamal. And so I think a big key in this series for Denver is I am just running a ton of screens for Jamal in this series. If it's triple screens at the top, if it's double, I am trying to create Jamal as much separation to the perimeter as possible to give him space. And with that space, just see if he can create something for himself. But it's going to be hard. McDaniels is the guy that I would throw on Jamal all series long. One of the best perimeter defenders in basketball. And you can do that because the rest of the guys can't create as much, right? We'll figure out how we defend MPJ. He's probably going to eat. We'll figure it out against KCP. But I want my best point of attack guy on Jamal all series long, and I want to see if he can legitimately disrupt him. And then on the flip side of that, if I'm Minnesota, I am running Jamal Murray off that line as much as possible, dude. I am funneling him inside where our length can be disruptive. If that's McDaniels getting his hand into lanes, if that's Naz Reid, if that's Rudy Gobert, if that's Kyle Anderson, if that's NAW, whoever, we're going to funnel him off the line and we're going to help on shots on the inside. So I think those are the keys, man. Really, like, I know it's stating the obvious, but it's how you defend Nikola Jokic and Jamal Murray, the best duo in all of basketball. And so, again, to restate, I am trying to get the ball out of Jokic's hands as much as possible, and I'm trying to run Jamal off the line and make our length disruptive, man. It's the hardest question to answer in all of the playoffs. There's no easy answer, right? Like, it's difficult. That's why the Nuggets are who they are, because they have the best duo in basketball. And so that's the biggest key to me. Can the best defense in basketball slow down the best offensive duo in all of basketball?
This Timberwolves defense is special. I've said it. I think it's the best defense of the last decade. They just have absolute studs everywhere. I think they have the best perimeter defense personnel in the NBA right now. I think they have 3 of the 15 best perimeter defenders on the planet. And then they also have the best interior defender on the planet in Rudy Gobert. And they have another really physical, big rebounding force in Karl-Anthony Towns, who is particularly important in this matchup, Logan, because you say you think it doesn't really matter. This is the one matchup where I disagree. Do I expect Jokic to dominate offensively? Yes, because he does that regardless. He's the best offensive player ever. But Minnesota is the one team that I think can legitimately take a chunk out of his efficiency in a way that nobody else can. Through the playoffs last year, he averaged 26.2 points per game against the T-Wolves on 57.5% true shooting. Against everybody else, he averaged 33 a night on 68% true shooting. Nobody guards him better in the NBA than Minnesota. I don't even think it's a question. And there's a couple big reasons for that. Number one, Gobert is as good as anybody on him in single coverage. And we've seen he's just such an unstoppable post scorer that nobody is really able to throw him off his game there. But if anybody can hold up on single possessions, if anybody can block a shot with their length, it's Rudy Gobert. But to me, the real weapon that is most impactful and something that Minnesota turned to a lot in this series last year is the fact that Karl-Anthony Towns guards Jokic better than most teams' best option. He is so huge. He has been so physical in this matchup. He's so long that he is able to hold up on those single coverage post-up possessions really quite well. Again, Jokic is exceptional against anybody. He's going to win out. But when you can put somebody other than by far your most impactful help defender on Jokic and you're not losing much there, that is when Gobert can act as a full-time helper, which means he is the all-time rim deterrent that we know him to be for everybody other than Jokic. It also means that he can affect some of those interior passes to Aaron Gordon, and he can deter cutters. He can help on some of those Jokic attempts when he comes over and tries to shoot a hook, like Rudy can be there as an imposing presence. So it's what the Lakers have tried to replicate with Rui, but it just doesn't work because Rui can't hold a candle to Jokic. He has no prayer in single coverage. There's no resistance. It's literally layups. Same goes for Naz Reid. Same goes for Kyle Anderson. It can't be anybody but Cat because the Timberwolves play 2 centers. They play 2 big-ass centers. But that look, I do think, gives Jokic more trouble than anybody else. Ultimately, he was still great in this series last year. He had one really rough shooting game that hurt his efficiency where he went 9 of 29. The Nuggets still produced really good offense because they're one of the best offenses ever with the best offensive player ever. But if anybody can make this ugly, and if anybody can take a chunk out of their offensive efficiency, it is the Minnesota Timberwolves because they also are really well built to guard Jamal. And we need Jamal to be better, just flat out. The guy averaged 23 a night on 47% true shooting versus the Lakers. That's just not going to cut it. And you talk about the impact of the length. That's where he struggled versus Minnesota this year. He gave him 17 a night, shot only 40% on twos. And he had a really good series against Minnesota last year, but that's without Jaden McDaniels. So that's different. And he will be the primary matchup in this series. There's no question about that. That's who they've put on him for all of the regular season matchups. And Jaden does a great job. That length, that back pressure is super annoying for Jamal. And you can funnel him into Gobert, and that is challenging. And it's very difficult for him to finish inside in this matchup. I also wonder, though, how much they throw Ant at him, because I think Ant presents a very interesting dynamic in terms of physicality. Jaden has the size and the length, but Ant has the strength to apply that ball pressure and just to give Jamal bumps and bruises. And the other advantage there is you have a taller, longer defender on MPJ. MPJ is basically unaffected by contests, but Jaden McDaniels is 6'9" with a 7-foot wingspan. He's just bigger and longer than Anthony Edwards. And so he is able to provide more of a legitimate contest, at least in those spots. I do think that they'll put McDaniels on Jamal as the prime matchup this series. But the beauty is they can easily switch, obviously, anytime Anthony Edwards or Nickeil Alexander-Walker's on the floor, and they have a great option no matter what. And I particularly think Jokic being effective as a pick and popper is going to be pretty key to the effectiveness of their two-man game when Gobert is on him. When Cat is on him, it doesn't matter as much because Gobert is going to be in that roamer rim protector role no matter what. But when Gobert is on Jokic, it's so crucial that Jokic draws him out of the paint, or if he doesn't, he's able to consistently punish him with those pick and pop jumpers, because that's where we saw Jamal have success as a driver against Anthony Davis. It's when Jokic pops and now AD has to take a step out to the free throw line. Jamal hits you with that nasty hesitation dribble. He's patient, and then he turns the corner and he gets downhill. When his pull-up jumper is off, as it was through a lot of that Lakers series, like, that gives him a valuable floor that he doesn't always have. And if Rudy Gobert is parked around the rim, he doesn't have that ceiling. So for that reason, I also think it's valuable for Minnesota to have Cat on that Jokic matchup, because it doesn't matter if you draw Cat out to the perimeter. You're totally fine with that. So it is a really significant challenge. Ultimately, I think this is the best offensive duo on the planet. This is the best offense on the planet. I expect them to figure it out enough. But this Minnesota defense is special, and they're particularly well built to challenge this Denver offense.
Yeah, you've talked me into it a little bit, man. There is really nobody better that can match up against these two stars. Like a guy you didn't even mention, McDaniels and Ant, great answers for Jamal Murray. I mean, if Mike Conley's getting beat out there and you need to go with a full defensive five too, dude, you could even throw like Nickeil Alexander-Walker down there, and you just have insane length and so much depth to throw it. Like, you've got three legitimate guys you can throw it Jamal. You got two legitimate guys you can throw it Jokic. Nobody else in the NBA can say that. Like, their length really could be disruptive. The one area that scares me about Karl-Anthony Towns in this series specifically is his foul trouble. And that's where I'm worried about if Jokic can get him in foul trouble a lot. And I found a number pretty ridiculous. Had a great series in round one, right? 19, 10, and 3 on 53, 53, 89 splits. Nobody can guard him in Phoenix. You had 4.3 fouls per game in that series. That's against, guys that don't, get guys in foul trouble. Jokic is a guy that legitimately can with his physicality. And then 2, on his career, Karl-Anthony Towns averages 3.9 fouls per playoff game.
Yeah.
Carson, since the merger, that's tied 20th highest, like, point blank, period. And Cat is like one of the only guys in the 21st century on that list. Like, the majority of that list is guys from the 90s and 80s when the game is so much more physical. They're calling more fouls. Like, Cat sticks out like a sore thumb on that list, dude. And my one concern about him, because I think he's the X factor in this series, I think he's got to pull his weight offensively, and I think he has to do a hell of a job of locking up Jokic, doing his best on Jokic defensively. Yes. I think Cat is the X factor in this series, and it scares me that I think Jokic could maybe get him in foul trouble and get him off the floor.
Cat is definitely important in this series. We just got the best version of him that we've seen in the playoffs, and that's even with the fact that he was in a lot of foul trouble, and it's frustrating, and you only get 28 minutes a game. When he was on the floor, though, he was really effectively mismatch attacking. He was shooting the hell out of the ball. He wasn't turning it over recklessly like he has in previous runs, only 2.2 turnovers per 36 minutes, and he scored 25 points per 36 on 68% true shooting. Simply put, the Suns were just way too small and way too slight, and he was getting what he wanted against those guys. That's a very different dynamic here, because this is a Denver team that is huge, and specifically, Aaron Gordon is going to guard him much better than any Sun did, because Cat relies on that mismatch attacking. He is not an overly skilled post scorer. He relies on bullying dudes, and when he's coming downhill, he can get out of control on those drives if you can physically match up to him. And he might pick up his dribble too early or settle for a really tough floater. Aaron Gordon is much better equipped to force him into those tough shots than any Phoenix Sun was. Last year in this series, it's a small sample size, of course, but Cat only averaged 0.82 points per isolation and 0.87 points per post-up. So his self-created offense was very inefficient, and he averaged a lot of turnovers, and he averaged a lot of fouls. And I think you're absolutely right. That's the challenge. And they're absolutely going to go back between Gobert on Jokic and Cat on Jokic. I think we'll see heavy distribution of both, but they need him to be available on the floor. He could get into foul trouble in that matchup if he's not careful. And so I worry about him being a super consistent second source of offense, because the matchup is just so much tougher. I really felt confident that if he could stay on the floor against the Suns, he was just going to dominate offensively. Ant hyped him up, bro. I love that presser where he was just telling him, just fucking stay out of foul trouble. When you're on the court, you're unstoppable. It's not as true in this matchup. I think there's a lot more potential for a Cat struggle than there was against Phoenix.
I think so too. Real quick about Ant. Bro, I love how much of a leader at a young age Anthony Edwards is. Like, I think that's a huge factor that a lot of teams don't have, man.
Yeah.
Ant is a vocal leader. He is a mentality changer. And I just love that anytime he's out there on the court, man, he's talking guys up. He is telling them what we need to do, what we need to execute. Like, he's got that mentality, and he's just a great team leader. To see this guy so young, communicating like this, getting these guys rallied up and fired up, it's really impressive, man. And it makes me believe a little more in Ant as a leader of this team and as a superstar. And talk about Cat being a consistent secondary source of offense. The guy who's got to be the primary source of offense for Minnesota is Anthony Edwards. And I think he is a huge X factor in this series as well. I don't think Denver has a ton of perimeter personnel they can throw at him that is going to stop him. We saw a lot of different looks in the regular season with Ant, man. If it was MPJ, if it was KCP, if it was Gordon. I mean, and there's some games too where, the Minnesota changes to like a 2-3 zone against Ant in Minnesota. My conclusion, I don't think anybody can guard or stay in front of Anthony Edwards. That's my take. I think he's going to get whatever he wants. I think kind of like Jokic, it's going to be forcing him into shots that he doesn't want to take, playing him physical, and just trying to throwing him off like a little of his game. I want to force him to settle for jump shots and hope he doesn't hit them, basically. I'm swarming Ant. I'm playing him super physically. And out of pick and roll, I'm going to throw him a ton of different looks. And I want him to make him kill me as a playmaker than as a scorer, right? I'm not always going to throw doubles at him like Phoenix was doing, but I'm going to strategically throw doubles, vary up my coverages against Ant. Because I think one-on-one, man, I don't really think there's anybody that can hang with him defensively. I think Gordon's a good matchup, but I still think Gordon's just got that speed, explosiveness advantage.
It's going to be KCP.
That's tough. That's tough, man.
I think he's a better matchup than Gordon, but it is tough. I mean, KCP can hold up against bigger dudes, dude. Like, I don't want to downplay how great of a defender he is. He held up relatively well against LeBron freaking James, who we know is bigger and even stronger than Ant. But it is true. There have been moments. I went back and rewatched all of the regular season meetings between these two teams. Like, Ant can just go through him sometimes. He's just such a freak athlete. But KCP is a lot better than anything Phoenix had to offer. I will say that.
For sure. And on the flip side of that, what I'm doing if I'm Minnesota is I'm giving Ant a lot of high volume, high pick and roll involving Jokic too, outside of, just giving Ant straight up isolations. I want to see if Ant can get that pull-up jumper going in the mid-range. But you hit on a key point there against KCP, Carson, is Ant has these traits that are just so reliable for a playoff setting, specifically the athleticism, like the explosiveness. You just have to be such an elite isolation defender to stay in front of the guy. There's very few guys in the league that can. That strength is a huge component. Like, Ant is just going to go through your chest sometimes, man, and just get by you. And I think his decision-making is pretty reliable for how young he is. You mentioned it in the Phoenix series. There are plays where he makes a boneheaded decision or two, and I'm going to test him. If I'm Denver in this series, a young guy, I am testing him as much as possible with his decision-making, although I do trust Ant. I think he's grown a lot there. The one thing that's concrete with Ant, in my opinion, is that he is a playoff riser. This guy's a dog. He's an assassin. I mean that with like my whole chest. This kid is an assassin. He is a killer. Round one versus Phoenix, 31-8-6 on 65% true shooting with 2 steals a game. You mentioned it's not against great perimeter defense, but this has kind of been consistent. Like, in his playoff career, in most games, like, Ant has just performed better. His career playoff stats, he averages 5 more points per game on 3.4% better from the field and 4% better from deep. Statistically, he's just been better. And that's my big question mark with Ant, Carson, is what do we get out of him pull-up wise? That's the big swing factor for me, and how much of a factor. And if Ant is going to be the best player in this series or, second best, is his pull-up jump shooting. In the regular season, he's got 36.
Whoa.
I don't know, man. I don't know, man. I got
pretty crazy, bro.
I got big expectations for Ant. I don't expect
Jokic is playing a level above everybody on the planet, man. I don't know.
That's true. He's the best player on He's the best player in the world. But do you think Ant's been the second best player in these playoffs?
Well, 4 games.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's a small
but it's
sample
4
size, but
games. Like, I get that it's 4 playoff
mhm.
games. Of course, it means more, but it is still 4 games.
But could he be the second best player in the series?
I
Definitely.
fully expect him
Definitely.
to. If he's
Like,
not, Minnesota's gonna get worked. They need him to be a superstar.
yeah, they do. And in round one, that's exactly what he was. He was up 10% on his pull up jumpers from the regular season. He was up 5% on pull up threes from the regular season. Like, he just does it. I think Denver can make life harder on him, man. But I do think Ant's going to step up his game a little more. Like, I'm expecting minimum, 28 points per game very, very efficiently. Is it going to be enough? I don't know. That's really up to Minnesota's defense to decide and how much they can disrupt Denver on the other end. But I'm expecting very big things from Anthony Edwards-Carson. To me, the swing factor is, can he sustain this level of pull-up jump shooting? Because I do think he's just got traits that translate to every single playoff series and every single playoff game, man.
He was phenomenal in that first round series, and he has to be phenomenal again. This to me is the biggest key to this series is, can Ant replicate or come close to what he did last series? Because if he can't, if he can't come something close to toe-to-toe with Jokic, I don't think he needs to outplay Jokic or even play as well, but he's probably got to play something like a top 5 dude on the planet. Like, he has to be a dog in this series, and he was phenomenal, but there is some stuff where you question, okay, how completely sustainable is that? The strength, the athleticism, the rim pressure, there's no question. The pull-up shooting improvement, we've seen across 3 postseason series now, where he goes up by like 10% as a pull-up shooter. He goes from 44% effective field goal percentage to 55% in this past series. And he was really, really good in this matchup last year. Particularly, he was lethal out of pick and roll. 1.4 points per possession he scored out of pick and roll in this series, which is just absolutely disgusting. And the Nuggets are going to have a challenge there because KCP is awesome, but as we said, he's still a little bit small for that matchup. Aaron Gordon, I think you just need on Karl-Anthony Towns as much as possible, and he is giving up something in terms of quickness. And is going to test Jokic as a rim protector. I think the best coverage is a coverage that the Nuggets really like to play, which is Jokic in high drop. And then you can hopefully force Ant to beat you as a passer. You can force him to try to make those skip passers. He's not super consistent hitting Rudy off the roll. So I think that that is a good coverage. And if he gets red hot, you double outright. And I wouldn't be opposed to throwing doubles at him and making him beat you as a decision maker. You don't start in that place. That's more of a desperation play. But although I think he's mostly been good, you have been able to force him into some turnovers or frustrate him and get him to take some tougher jumpers, throwing those looks at him. I worry pick and roll about him turning the corner on Yoke when Yoke is coming out close to the level of the screen. Like, he's just so damn quick. But I thought Jokic mostly played him okay. It was just Ant being a dog, Ant making big shots. And that's what Ant's capable of doing. I'm not going to deny that. This is definitely a tougher matchup for him than Phoenix, because this team does have better point of attack defenders, and they're ultimately just bigger and longer and more dialed in, more consistent defensively across the board. But he can go crazy in this series. He just has to knock down his pull-up jumpers, and he has to make good decisions. And if he does those two things, he can play like a superstar, and that unlocks an offensive ceiling that Minnesota needs, because they were the best offense in terms of offensive rating in the first round. That was against a bad defense, but this was a Minnesota offense that was average in the regular season. And that was the biggest concern. Do they have the firepower to knock off the Denver Nuggets if they're an average offense? And they played like something a hell of a lot better than that in the first round. And Ant was the single biggest component. They need him to be at that level, or they're not going to win this series.
They also need their perimeter shooting to be at a really high level, too. They shoot 36.6% in their first round series against Phoenix, and floor spacing was crucial. Cat shoots 53%. Ant shoots damn near 44% from behind the arc, which is just dumb, man. I know Naz Reid only shoots 31%, but he's a better shooter than that. I think shooting variance is going to be pretty crucial in this one too, man. Just in terms of the difference that we get from these teams in the first round. It felt like Minnesota shot about expected from behind the arc. Denver shot well below their means. Denver shoots 30.8% from behind the arc against the Lakers, man. That is nearly 7% below their regular season average, 6.6 to be exact. And then on catch and shoot threes, the Nuggets shoot just 33% on those. And again, this is the Denver Nuggets offense where catch and shooting is traditionally going to be a wide open look for the Nuggets. Like, they generate a lot of those shots. They shot 6.4% below their average catch and shoot regular season average. It was everybody too, man. It wasn't just like one player or one guy not pulling their weight. It was basically everybody. Jokic shoots 33%. Murray's at 29. KCP is at 28. Like, the only guy that shot above 34% was Michael Porter Jr., who they needed to shoot the ball like that in that series, 48.8%. So another big key, and I think you can make this blanket statement for any playoff series ever, is going to be shooting variance. But it's a little more heightened in this series specifically because Denver needs to shoot the ball well. They shot really poorly against the Lakers, significantly below their regular season average. And Minnesota generated a high volume of high-quality looks against Phoenix very consistently, and they shot really well. So I think that's another big key in this series.
Denver is absolutely the better shooting team from beyond the arc. They're not the most high volume, but they just have big time shooters. KCP, MPJ, Jamal, all those guys are consistently year in, year out, 40% from deep. So they do have to be way better than they were last series. That was a big reason that Denver came out down in all those games. They just couldn't make their open threes in the first half. And that's where it becomes, like you said, get the ball out of Jokic's hands. I definitely don't expect Minnesota to do nearly as much hard doubling as LA did because they just have way better options to defend him in single coverage. But like, LA was able to succeed doubling Jokic, even though he was making the right decisions passing out of it, just because the guys around him weren't knocking down their shots enough until game 5 when they really did start doing that. I think particularly key is that MPJ is involved in this series significantly and that he maintains something close to his level, because last year, really throughout the playoff run, he wasn't at his best offensively. He still made some really impactful plays, but you just got flamethrower MPJ against LA. That's the MPJ that is absolutely terrifying. He was their second best player in that series, gave you 23 a night on 69% true shooting, and he's just one of the special all-time three-point shooters in the history of this game. Off movement from any angle, any level of contest. He's just water. And you get that MPJ, that is a special weapon to have out there on the floor. Very important. But it's also a reality that Minnesota is going to hound these shooters, and they are going to be willing to run them off the line and funnel them into Rudy Gobert. I think about that possession they had in the final couple of minutes against the Suns when they were closing that out. And they ran like 3 different dudes off the line, and eventually they forced Bradley Beal into a turnover because it's just so much length, so much pressure. You have to make decision after decision. You're not getting these open, high-value looks from beyond the arc. That's what Minnesota does to you. And so there may be more of a burden on Denver's guys in those spots. That being said, like, the Denver shooters just rise and fire. And MPJ especially, like, these are really knockdown shooters. They didn't play like it. I do want to acknowledge, if KCP isn't healthy, then that's terrifying for Denver. He was obviously able to come back and play. And with 5 days off, I expect him to play. But if he's hobbled, if he's not 100%, like, again, he has to draw the Ant matchup. And the downgrade from him into Brown and Watson trying to fill that same role of point of attack defense, but then where KCP is an amazing spot up shooter, those guys are very questionable. Or it's just more Reggie Jackson because you view him as like the first guy off the bench. But the Reggie Jackson experience is stressful and chaotic, to say the least. That would be really, really dangerous for Denver if KCP can't play or if he isn't himself.
I'd have them reeling on the ropes. Like, you're close to a knockout there. If you're Denver, they need it. And I'm so glad you said that, because that kind of gets to my final big key for Denver, Minnesota. And that's, will the Timberwolves dominate non-Jokic minutes? And how much really can we trust this bench? There is a huge gap between these two benches in terms of quality basketball players. Like, I love the Nuggets starting 5. I think it's the best in the NBA. But the bench, just straight up, Reggie Jackson, Christian Brown, Peyton Watson, and Justin Holiday versus Naz Reid, Nikhil Alexander Walker, Kyle Anderson, and Monte Morris. That's a very big gap. That is a huge gap. And so that not only does that mean that KCP has to be healthy, has to be up to the task of playing against Ant, like you also have no margin for any injury to any guy. If you lose any player and are expecting big minutes from any of these bench guys, like I said, Denver is reeling on the ropes, very close to being knocked out. Like I think if one guy was down or significantly hampered by an injury, I might take Minnesota to win this series, man. It could be that big of a game changer.
Absolutely. Depth is significant here. And there's a counterbalance between the fact that Denver has such exceptional role players in the starting five. Like they're 3 through 5. Those guys all do their jobs at such a high level. But once you get beyond that, Minnesota has, as we've said, like maybe the 2 best bench players, certainly 2 of the best bench players in this field. Nickeil Alexander-Walker played like 30 minutes a game last series. He was phenomenal. He's a hound defensively. He's knocking down his spot-up jumpers. He's making good decisions with the ball. The guy's a problem. I do think he's going to play less in this series. We didn't see a lot of Naz Reid in the scope of how much he could have played. And we didn't see like a big explosive Naz Reid game. I think that's very different in this series because we saw 23 minutes against the Suns with NAW, Conley, Ant, and Jaden McDaniels all on the floor together. So that is a 3-guard lineup with a 185-pound power forward. You're not doing that against Denver. You're certainly not doing that against Denver's starting 5. They're just so much bigger, so much more physical. So that's where I think you're going to have 2 bigs on the floor probably pretty much all the time when Jokic is out there. I can't imagine that Gobert really ever sits when Jokic is on the floor, just because I think although Cat's good on him, like that kind of depends upon having Gobert in that helper role, in that roamer role. So I think we'll see more Naz. But yeah, 2 exceptional bench players versus a big old question mark. That could make a difference in this series. Minnesota just has more basketball players who you trust. They were also a lot more consistent last round. Like just being locked in is a key for this Denver team. Last year in the playoffs, they were the most consistently locked team that there was. They had the highest floor. They came in every game and you knew what you were getting more so than anybody else. Boston was this topsy-turvy experience of floors and ceilings. Denver was going to produce great offense. They were going to take care of the basketball. They were going to compete defensively, and that made them a very convincing champion. First round was different because of the shooting, because of Jamal, but also just because of decision-making, ball security in games 4 and 5. Like that wasn't the Denver team that we're used to seeing. And simply put, they have to be more dialed in. They have to more consistently play to the level that we know they're capable of, because you had to clutch up. You had to eke out games against the Lakers. This Minnesota team is a lot better, and they are a really tough matchup for you.
And I mean, if they come out like they're scrappy, man, they're dogs. Like
they're crazy. They're crazy men.
They are crazy, and they're led out by the craziest of men, Anthony Edwards. Like there's not going to be anything easy in this series. Like
no.
If you sleepwalk through the first 2 quarters like you did against LA, Minnesota could be beating you by 20. And let me tell you, it's a lot harder coming back against 20 against Minnesota than it is going to be against LA. Like you're just going to be sitting there crossing your fingers, hoping for an offensive lull, which is maybe the one thing, man. I wonder if there's one game or 2 games in this series where we get a bad Minnesota offensive performance. And what I mean by that is very similar to what we saw in game 2 against Phoenix, where all the role players stepped up. Mike Conley has a torrential run. Naz Reid goes crazy. Like all the little guys step up and do their thing. Cat gets in foul trouble early, doesn't play a whole lot. Anthony Edwards has a really bad pull-up jump shooting game. I wonder if any of game 2 rears its ugly head, right? Because Phoenix didn't offer a ton of resistance. Going up against Denver, where it is going to be a little more physical, they're going to make you work a little more. I wonder if we get a dud or 2 of a game from Minnesota offensively where Denver blows them out, because there is still that advantage. Like Denver has struggled so much, and that's the thing, man. I don't think we've seen Denver when Denver's played at 80%, 85% of what they're capable of at their best. Like I don't think we've seen Denver at their best, and I wonder if we get a flip of that. Like that's the best that we can expect out of Minnesota. But we did see that one game, and they eke it out because it's against Phoenix. That's one quotient that I wonder, Carson, that we get in this series, where if Minnesota really struggles to create offense in a game or 2, and Denver just soundly outplays them in those games.
My last key to this series, Logan, is specifically clutch offense. I do believe that Denver is just clearly the better offense in this series. Minnesota played at a super impressive level, but what we've seen from Denver has been so much more sustained. It's to me so much more replicable. It doesn't require anybody playing above their means. It's just what they do. And this is specifically the best clutch offense that I have seen in my lifetime. In the regular season, Denver posted a 123 clutch offensive rating. Ridiculous. They were the best clutch team in basketball. Minnesota struggled, posted an offensive rating of 104 in the clutch. In the playoffs, take this with a grain of salt because it's only 9 minutes. It's not much of a sample size, but Denver is a clutch offensive rating of 163. Like, it's just comical how good they've been. Yeah, 9 minutes, but that's how they won these games, right? Oh, mid, unimpressive basketball from Denver. And then, okay, I guess we're just going to run Murray, Jokic pick and roll to death. Jamal is going to make all of his pull-up jumpers. Jokic is going to bully you in single coverage whenever he has a chance. Game over. Like, it's just truly some of the hardest offense to stop that we've ever seen. And that's the most dynamic two-man game that we've seen in a long time. They have the best scorer and passer on the planet, Nikola Jokic. Like, the things they have to lean on. MPJ spot-up shooting if you overhelp. Aaron Gordon in the dunker spot if you converge too hard on a Jokic roll or a Jokic post-up. Like, it's just so damn good. And Minnesota is going to rely on Ant a lot in those spots. They go to Ant in the clutch. And specifically, when it gets grimy, it's going to be pull-up jumpers. And between the two, which formula do I think is more consistent? Because I'm expecting a lot of close games here. I think these are two really good basketball teams. And when it comes to closing out games, nobody on the planet is better than Denver. And I still think Minnesota has a question mark there. So ultimately, both teams are huge. Both teams are physical. Both teams are awesome. Both teams have a lot of good basketball players. I'm going to take Denver in 6. I thought about going Denver in 7 here because I think so highly of Minnesota, and I'm worried about KCP having the tweaked ankle. But I think the clutch gap is going to matter here. And as much as I love Ant, I can't expect him to be as great as he was last series. And because I'm not super confident in Ant being that, or excuse me, in Cat being that consistent second option, I just think the gap in terms of like night after night offensive brilliance is going to be the difference maker here. Minnesota can make life hard on Denver, harder than anybody else can. But I also think this Denver defense is good. And I do think they're big and I do think they're physical. And I don't think that they're outmatched here. So give me the team that I just trust to create the best shots. This is why I believe in Denver as the title contender. I think they have convincingly the best player on the floor. And I think they have the best offensive formula.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is also going to be a battle of just two gladiators, man. They're going to go to war here. Yeah, I wrote down my keys to the series. I wrote out how the Nuggets win this series, and I wrote down my list, and I wrote how the Timberwolves win this series. The one that I struggled with to mark off for Minnesota, I wrote Anthony Edwards plays like a bona fide number one superstar. Okay, I can see that. The one that I couldn't mark off, they disrupt Nikola Jokic and Jamal Murray enough. Enough is the key word there. I just don't think it can be enough. And I think this is super competitive. I'm going to take Nuggets in 7. I do think this goes the distance. The team that I trust more to create easy offense, though, is Denver. I just think we've seen it too many times, man. I hate going to this comparison because I always do this with Denver and Kansas City, but I have seen Kansas City do so many improbable things in the clutch situations with their backs against the wall, and I have seen Denver do the exact same thing in these big clutch situations with their backs against the wall. It's boring to pick back-to-back champions. It is boring to pick the same juggernaut to keep steamrolling NBA teams or whatever team. But I'm going to pick the boring answer because I think it's the right one, man, and I've seen the Nuggets do it too many times. So I think this goes the distance, man. I think this is the most competitive series of the playoffs, but I'm going to take the Nuggets in 7.
I absolutely expect this to be the toughest series that Denver has in the West. I think Minnesota has separated themselves, at least based on what we've seen up to this point, from the other teams who we might have thought were on the same level. They were just so consistently outstanding in that series. But again, you don't have those sort of like overwhelming physical advantages, the bully ball stuff that you're doing against Phoenix. Nobody is better built to match up with you as Denver. Same goes vice versa. But it does feel like Minnesota has more boxes to check. I believe in this Denver offense being one for the ages, one of the best we've seen. And I think they can just play much better than they did in that first round. I expect them to. Minnesota can win this series. You get Jamal, if it's the calf strain or if he's just not playing up to his level, because maybe he can't always elevate to the level that he did in the bubble and that he did last year. I believe in Jamal Murray. I love Jamal Murray, but he's been exceptional. So maybe he is more inconsistent in this run. And maybe KCP is hurt. And if Ant balls the hell out, and if you really give Jamal fits with just ball pressure and the athleticism and the length, it can happen. And again, you do match up better physically than anybody else. You're not going to get bullied on the interior like a lot of these other teams are. But I believe in Denver. I have a lot of faith in them pulling through. And I do think they're the better team here, ultimately.